much to Michael Berkman and Chris Veeam and the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here and to talk to you about my forthcoming book. So I'm going to walk through the argument and the key analyses, and I very much look forward to answering your questions. So this is co-authored work with a former student of mine, now distinguished associate professor at the University of Utah, James Curry. The book looks at what the effect of polarization is on lawmaking, on policy making, the policy impact of polarization. If there's anything most people know about how Congress has changed, it's that it's a lot more partisan than it used to be. This figure displays a measure of partisan voting, the percentage of votes that divide 90% of Republicans from 90% of Democrats. It used to be quite rare for roll call votes to break down in such a starkly partisan manner. But in recent Congresses, more than half of House roll call votes break down in this manner, as do 30 to 40% of Senate roll call votes. It's almost a parliamentary level of partisanship. Another angle on these changes is to look at party cohesion in Congress over time. This figure displays average Senate Republican and Democratic Party loyalty between 1956 and 2018. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the typical senator voted with his party on controversial issues just over 60% of the time. In the 1980s, just over 70% of the time. In the 1990s, just over 80% of the time. And since 2000, senators have voted with their parties on average above 89% of the time. The story is the same in the House. The question is whether this increased party cohesion makes the majority party more self-sufficient in lawmaking. This figure displays the House majority, the cohesion of the House majority party over time. So it's the same data I just displayed, but now shown in bar graph form. But we can't just compare levels of cohesion over time, because whether a party is able to execute on its agenda without any cross-party support also depends on the size of its majority. So, majority parties' margins of control in the Congress since 1994 have been quite narrow. A majority party with only a narrow margin of control has to marshal very high levels of party cohesion in order to legislate without any cross-party support. So what's displayed here is the threshold that they would need based on the size of their majority, the threshold of cohesion that would be necessary if the party is going to legislate without any cross-party support. So what you can see here, looking at this graph, is first of all, for most of the time series, cohesion in Congress is not quite high enough to reach that threshold level of what would be necessary to legislate without any cross-party support. The huge Democratic majorities in the 1960s and 1970s rarely reached the level. But what you began to see is in the 1980s, Democrats first began to produce the kind of levels of cohesion that would be necessary to legislate without any cross-party support. Then they lost the majority. The Republican majorities of the Clinton and Bush years were so narrow that even though they were highly cohesive, they were not cohesive enough to legislate without any cross-party support. What we're seeing now in the most recent Congresses is levels of cohesion that, in conjunction with the size of the majority, are high enough for majority parties to legislate without any cross-party support. So this is for the House of Representatives. I also have the data here for the Senate. Now, the Senate is not a majority rule institution, so in many cases, even if you have a majority, it's not enough to legislate. But for those matters, like budgets, where a simple majority is sufficient in the Senate, then what you see is that in recent years, cohesion has been high enough for majority parties to legislate without cross-party support. Really unusual for the time series. You know, look how far away from sufficient levels of cohesion the Congresses of the 20th century were. Concurrent with this dramatic increase in partisanship, members have instituted more centralized, leadership-driven legislative processes that are thought to facilitate partisan lawmaking. party leaders take a much more assertive role in managing floor debate in both chambers. In the House, this takes the form of restrictive rules that limit or prohibit members from offering amendments to legislation on the floor. Almost all rules today are restrictive, and almost half are closed to all amendments. So just take it or leave it, no amendments permitted. In the Senate, leaders make much heavier use of their procedural prerogatives to limit offering of amendments. And as you can see here, amending activity on the Senate floor has been curbed. More policy development is now centralized in party leadership offices. You can see this from the percentage of bills that passed Congress but did not go through a committee process. This is the so-called departure from regular order. That used to be that nearly all bills were reported that passed were reported from a committee or had seen a committee process. But now just over half of bills that pass go through a regular committee process. So given these changes, increased party cohesion and centralization of power in Congress over bill development and then over floor management, majority parties should have strengthened their capacity to enact their policy agendas. But have they? A lot of scholarship suggests that the answer to that question is yes. That there's a well-known theory in the study of congressional politics called conditional party government, and the argument there is that as parties become more cohesive and polarized from one another, leaders will empower members will empower their leaders to give them more procedural authority to push through the party's agenda. There are other theories with scholarly jargon that we're somewhat known for. Procedural cartel theory also argues that stronger partisanship, more polarized parties, will lead to stronger leaders more able to carry out their agendas. But what Jim and I are doing in this book is, well, let's look at the data. Is this happening? Are these changes occurring at the level of policy outcomes, the laws that Congress passes? So those are our questions. We ask, are more laws passed on narrow party lines? Are today's majority parties more effective at delivering on their policy agendas? To answer this question, we collected a number of sources of data on patterns of party support on enacted laws, as well as on parties' ability to carry out their agendas. And what we find, the short answer is no. They're not getting any better at delivering on their policy agendas. Parties' ambitions are frequently checked via veto players controlled by the opposing party. And second, contemporary parties, majority parties, are not as cohesive as they seem in the roll call data that I just displayed to you. I'll go through the evidence on each of these points. So I'll just highlight for you the sorts of data that Jim and I put together. We collected data on all passage votes on laws, both on routine legislation as well as on landmark legislation. So what's the breakdown? How many Democrats, what share of Democrats are in favor, what share of Republicans in favor? We also looked at party agendas. That's really the acid test of a party's effectiveness. Can it really legislate on what it truly cares about? And so in order to get at this, we read the speeches given by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader at the start of the Congress. What issues did they highlight in those opening Congress speeches? And then we also looked at the bills that were slotted into the leadership bill numbers, so HR 1 through 10 and S 1 through 5, going back through the 1980s. And then just did legislative histories of each of those bills, asking the simple question, whether parties got most of what they wanted, whether they got a bill through but had to back down on key matters, so they got some of what they wanted, or whether they got none of what they wanted, meaning that the legislative effort failed altogether. And then for those issues on which they were successful either partially successful or fully successful. We asked how they did it, and did they do so by steamrolling the other party, by passing legislation over the opposition of the other party or not, whether they managed to get the other party on board in some way. So I'm going to show you a series of graphs displaying patterns in passage votes, House and Senate, and then I'll turn to the agendas data. So first, this is the size of the agenda. What we learn here is that there hasn't been any change over this whole period. It starts with the 99th Congress, 1985-86. No significant change in the size of the agenda that majority parties want to enact based on the measures that I described. There's also not a party difference. Republicans and Democrats put forward agendas that are roughly the same size when they each have the majority. So first, let's look at passage votes. This shows you the percentage of the minority party voting in favor of legislation that successfully passes the Senate. I put a reference line at 50% because what that indicates to you is that when that percentage dips below 50%, that means that a majority of the minority party opposed it. And what you see here is that very rarely does legislation pass over a majority of the minority party in the Senate. That includes all laws, as well as landmark laws, as gauged by Yale political scientist David Mayhew. So he has a list going back to actually to the 40s of the most significant legislation that passed each Congress. So that's the Senate. This is the House. Once in a while, it dips below 50% on average, but not very often. The two standout outlier cases are the 103rd Congress and the 111th Congress. Those are Congresses with unified Democratic control under Bill Clinton in the 103rd and under Barack Obama in the 111th. So you might think, well, parties steamroll when they have unified government, except you don't see the same pattern so starkly in the 108th and the 109th under unified Republican control with George W. Bush. So, in fact, with statistical analysis, there's not a statistically significant difference between unified and divided government in terms of the share of the minority party voting in favor of enacted laws. These next two figures look at the so-called roll rate. This is the frequency with which legislation is passed over the opposition of a majority of the minority party. So this is a frequency count. Again, most laws simply garner majority support from both parties. But unusual. There's the outliers again, the 103rd and the 111th. But in general, you don't see parties successfully steamrolling their opposition on legislation. Third measure, and this is true for the Senate as well. Third, we looked at we call it when the majority party needed minority party votes for passage. In other words, when looking at the final passage vote, did the majority party put up a majority of the chamber or not? If not, then it needed some cross-party support in order to pass the legislation. And what you see is that in this House of Representatives, most of the time, the majority party does not need help from the minority party to pass legislation. It gets support from the minority party, but it didn't need it to pass it. But on the landmark laws, more likely to need help. And there's the data for the Senate. So across all these six figures, not much evidence of partisan lawmaking. In fact, what's really interesting about these figures, to my mind, is that there's just no trend line. I showed you some remarkable trends at the start of this of my talk on the rise of partisanship or changes in procedure, the extent to which leaders control the process now, and the extent to which they go around committees outside of the so-called legislative regular order. Big trends in how Congress works internally. But in terms of outcomes, there aren't trends. Most legislation garners support from both parties, including the important legislation. So then going beyond the aggregate patterns, we then wanted to know whether parties have the capability to enact their agendas. Are today's more cohesive parties better at getting the things they really want out of the legislative process? So based on the approach that I described to you before, drawing on leadership reserved bill numbers and the speeches given by the leaders at the start of the Congress, we have 265 cases over the period since 1985 that we then construct legislative histories on. And here's the trends there. So first, I'm showing you total failure, where the majority party had an agenda item but couldn't pass it. Couldn't pass anything related to it. No legislation. Well, there is somewhat of an increase in failure, not an increase in success. It's precisely the opposite of what you might expect based on the increase in party cohesion and centralization of power. Parties tick along and get some of what they want at a fairly steady rate over the whole time period. The least likely outcome, only 20% of the cases in the data set, is a clear win, where the majority party really got what it wanted. This is out of the constructing this out of the legislative histories. This would be covered as a win in the newspapers and in the Capitol Hill publications like the CQ Weekly. So our next question that Jim and I asked, how do they succeed when they succeed? So dropping out all the cases of failure and looking at cases of success, either most of parties achieving most of their goals or some of their goals, how did they do it? Did they do it over the opposition of a majority of the minority party in both chambers? Mostly not, except for the 111th Congress under Barack Obama. That Congress, everything that the majority party achieved that was part of its agenda was done so over a majority of the minority party Republicans. But that's it. It wasn't the start of a trend. It was just an unusual, remarkably unusual Congress. Note, the 15th was a little high. That's 115th. This was unified government under President Trump. Somewhat high, but nothing like what we saw in the 111th Congress. The more typical way that a majority party succeeds is with the support of a majority of the minority party in either House or Senate. And even more typically, with at least one of the top party leaders of the minority party voting in support, meaning the minority leader or the minority whip. Since 1985, there have only been 12 majority party agenda items on which a majority party got most of what it wanted and did so over the opposition of a majority of the opposing party in both chambers and a majority of, and over the opposition of the minority party leaders in both chambers. So this is it. These are the 12. So it met the three criteria, a real partisan steamroll. So we can look at them. We can see some very significant pieces of legislation here, like the Affordable Care Act, number 3, or number 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They're going in reverse order from when they happened. They happen when they happen in unified government, but this is not a long list going back to 1985, obviously. And it's very hard to make the case that these are the most important laws that have passed since the Reagan years. Motor voter in the 103rd Congress, not a very important law. It did not transform either voter registration levels or voter turnout as people hoped it would. PAYGO was just a budget rule that only lasted until Democrats lost control of the chamber. The reauthorization of SCHIP, number 5, this is significant. But the more important enactment relating to SCHIP was its creation in the first place in 1997 as part of a bipartisan deal between the Republican Congress and President Clinton. Note also the remarkable party reversals on 2 of these cases. The crime bill is on the list. This was a Democratic Party steamroll over Republican opposition that then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton had to apologize for because of the three strikes and you're out, and it's a contribution to the rise of mass incarceration. And you've got Medicare Part D, which Republicans created and unified government under George W. Bush over the opposition of most Democrats, which expanded Medicare to cover prescription drug benefits, which outpatient prescription drug benefits, which the federal government had never previously covered. So two sort of ideological reversals from what you might expect are on this list of 12. Here's a list of equally important laws passed during the same time period that were passed on a bipartisan basis. I think this is especially a problem for political scientists. We tend to think that the important legislation is the controversial legislation. But if you're studying public policy, that's not the case. Anyway, so here's a list of bipartisan achievements during the period. Includes, and it's not all good policy, but it's important policy for understanding the shape of the law. This includes the historic 1986 tax reform, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1991 that successfully addressed the problem of acid rain, the welfare reform legislation that abolished AFDC and created TANF, the creation of the state children's health insurance program, the major deregulation of the financial services industry that happened in 1999, No Child Left Behind's expansion of the federal role in elementary and secondary education, the American Taxpayer Relief Act that ended the fiscal cliff and raised tax rates on the highest earning taxpayers in 2012, and the 21st Century Cures Act, which broadly transformed FDA drug approvals and significantly boosted federal funding for medical research. So most legislating that happens over this time period is bipartisan. The standout, unusual partisan cases are not the most important pieces of legislation that occurred during the time period. And there's a lot of very important legislation that occurred on a bipartisan basis, worked out via, in many cases, this is hard bargaining that takes a long time. Doesn't usually happen in one Congress. It carries through over multiple Congresses before there is legislative success or breakthroughs of this kind. Now, Jim also looked at the question of, well, when majority parties fail, why are they failing? Are they being blocked by the opposing party? Or, because the opposing party often controls key veto points? Or are they instead failing because they can't cohere sufficiently within their own ranks? So in order to get at this, we look at where does legislation fail. So when you trace a legislative initiative through the process, where did it stop? Where did it end? So was the bill introduced? Was it reported from committee? And that can tell us something about how or why it failed. We find that the single most common reason for a majority party failing on one of its agenda items is the 60-vote threshold in the Senate, the so-called supermajority Senate. That's the most common reason, and that's usually something you'd class as a veto player, that the other party controlled that 60th vote and prevented a majority party from doing what it wanted to do. There are a few cases where it was intra-party disagreement because Democrats did have 60 votes during the 111th Congress, 60 seats in the Senate during the 111th Congress, and still couldn't do some of the things they wanted to do. That's the most common reason. But the second most common reason is what we call no formal action, which basically means a bill was introduced, the leadership talked about it, and then it never got reported from committee. They never could work it out in committee to move forward on the legislation. That should be regarded as a problem internal to the majority party, because there's no reason why a majority party shouldn't be able to report a bill out from a committee if it wants to move forward on a legislative item. So as we we've got some other cases. Presidential veto is not a super important cause of majority party failure during this time period, in great part because the president's party is often in a position to block in the Senate, so that it never makes it to be vetoed. As we group all these causes of failure or points of failure for a majority party, find that about half of majority party agenda failures appear to be due to intra-party conflict rather than to veto points. So there's no evidence here that parties are being more blocked today by their opposition than they were. We might think that based on the data that I showed you at the start of the presentation on the rise of party cohesion in Congress. You might think that these highly cohesive parties, if they are failing to legislate on their agenda items, well, that has to be because they're being blocked by the opposing party. But the data on the legislative histories of majority party agenda items don't bear that interpretation out. They are not being blocked more often by veto players. This tracks the trends in each of the, or the lack of trends, in each of those causes of majority party failure. Let me give you some examples. Remarkably, every majority party possessing unified control of government in our data set during this time period was unable to reach sufficient intra-party consensus on at least one of its top agenda priorities, causing it to fail in executing on that agenda item. So every majority party over this time period, in full command of unified control, failed on a top priority because it couldn't get together internally. Start with the Clinton health care plan. This is 1993-94. Liberal and moderate Democrats could not reach agreement on key policy questions, such as whether employers should be required to pay employee health care costs or whether the cost of premiums should be capped. They could not reach agreement on that. One of the key committees in the House couldn't report a bill. In the Senate, the two committees that had jurisdiction reported diametrically opposed bills. Never could work out those problems internally to the party. It didn't fail because it was blocked by the opposing party. It failed because they couldn't coalesce internally. In the 108th Congress, this is under George W. Bush, 2003-4, the goal was to make the Bush tax cuts permanent. That was something that Republicans prioritized. But within the Republican Party, some members were concerned about deficits. And so there was disagreement. Should we make all the Bush tax cuts permanent or only some? And if we're going to make only some permanent, should we concentrate on lower income taxpayers or higher income taxpayers? They couldn't come to agreement. So the House moved forward on a bill, but the Senate never acted. In the 109th Congress, 2005-6, the major issue was Social Security reform. Right after the 2004 elections, when George W. Bush won re-election, he and Vice President Dick Cheney toured the country promoting major Social Security reform, the creation of private accounts within Social Security. It was designated H.R. 1 and S.1 in the House and the Senate. Neither chamber ever reported a bill from committee. Republicans could not get together on the issue internally. It never came up for a vote. So it's not in the measures that I displayed to you earlier on, because there was never a roll call vote. When parties can't agree internally, they tend not to take votes to demonstrate to the public how disorganized they are. In the 111th Congress, the key Democratic Party failure was on climate change mitigation. House Democrats were eventually able to get a bill. This was very tough politics. They were eventually able to get a bill out of the House, but 44 Democrats opposed it. And the bill would not have passed the House without 8 Republican votes. So they needed some cross-party support just to get the bill out of the House. In the Senate, the intra-party divisions on climate change were even more difficult. The Senate, a fully unified Democratic caucus with 60 votes for 5 months in the 111th Congress could have passed it without a Republican support, but Democratic senators from oil drilling and coal mining states were expected to vote no. They were going to need support from 5 to 8 Republican senators, which was not forthcoming, so they couldn't get that bill done. And then, of course, most famously, in 2017, the Republican effort to repeal and replace Obamacare, which was pursued under expedited processes that would have allowed Republicans to pass the legislation without any cross-party support, budget reconciliation in the Senate. So the filibuster was not an issue. But the first effort in the House, they had to pull the bill. They finally got it out of the House, but only with a lot of Republicans voting no, barely made it out of the House. And in the Senate, they bargained all summer long in 2017, but could not get together on a major reform. Finally, as a last-ditch effort, they proposed so-called skinny repeal, which was a very modest piece of legislation that would not have undone any significant provisions of the Affordable Care Act. It would have left the subsidies in place. It would have left the insurance marketplaces in place. The regulations on insurance companies would have remained in place. And that was tanked by McCain in the late-night vote. I was sort of surprised at how much media coverage that got, because skinny repeal was such a weak piece of legislation. Even if it had passed, it was nothing close to repealing Obamacare. So the Republican Party was completely at odds over what to do on that issue. So what this leads us to think is that the roll call data that we've seen so much of, and that I started my talk with, are misleading us as to how our party politics is really working. That contemporary parties are not as unified as they seem. Let me offer you some evidence in support of that. First, let's look at other measures aside from roll call votes. So this is coverage of party conflict, congressional party conflict, in the newspapers, so newspaper searches. If you follow the newspapers, you wouldn't think that the Republican Party after 2010 was a unified party. There was a lot of news stories about factional conflict within the Republican Party, the Tea Party. The leadership turmoil. Boehner had to step down due to pressures within his own party. That is not normal for contemporary congressional politics. And when I say contemporary, I mean going back to the modern Congress after the World War II. So really remarkable set of divisions in the party. It's not showing up in any of the roll call data that I displayed. The roll call data look like the Republican Party's marching in lockstep. You look at news coverage, not the case. Look at turmoil in the leadership, not the case. The concern is that there's a lot of selection bias in what we see in terms of the roll call record. Leaders naturally prefer to avoid questions that divide their parties internally. I think they're more able to do that in the past. Take a look at these series of quotations here from leaders talking about their strategy on floor agenda setting. So here's former Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, saying it was always important to get 218 before we brought a bill to the floor, especially if it was a partisan bill. You needed to make sure you had the majority before you brought a bill to the floor. So in other words, you're not going to take a bill to the floor where the party is going to be divided. Because the Republican Party didn't have much more than 218 votes during this time period. You need all the Republicans. There's Boehner saying if you don't have 218 votes, you have nothing. Here's Pelosi. This is something she's known for routinely saying at caucus meetings. If you don't have 218 votes, we're just having a conversation. You've got to have the votes before we take it to the floor. So that's their selection bias. Roll call votes are not happening on all the issues. They're happening on issues where the parties want to be on display. And changes and issues where the parties are internally divided are more likely to get censored out of the roll call record. There's reason to think they're more capable of doing that now because there are vastly more caucus meetings than there used to be. They meet so frequently as parties in closed-door settings. But Congress has not always done that. The House Democratic Caucus was dormant for 50 years before 1969, so they just did not meet. They would meet at the start of a Congress to organize the committees, and then they didn't meet after that. And so all the conflict within the party is going to play out on the floor because they don't strategize in caucus. During the 1970s, House Republicans met in conference only about once a month on average. House Democrats were meeting less than once a month. The frequency of party caucus meetings began rising in the 1980s for House Republicans and for House Democrats after 1994. The Senate Democrats only started holding their weekly meetings in 1981 after they lost the majority in the 1980 elections. But Hill parties now meet weekly in both chambers. So a lot is happening in those caucus settings where issues within the party are being worked out, and if they can't be worked out, the issues do not come to the floor. The second way in which the roll call record gives us a distorted picture of internal party politics is the rise of party messaging. These are votes that are taken for the purpose of highlighting differences between the parties, but where it's understood that the measure on which the vote is taken has no chance of becoming law. So here's Olympia Snow defining it. Rather than putting forward a plausible, realistic solution to a problem, members on both sides offer legislation that's designed to make a political statement. Specifically, the bill or amendment is drafted to make the opposing side look bad on an issue is not intended to ever actually pass. That when members are casting roll call votes, they think of them differently depending on whether the measure is actually likely to become law, like a real legislatively real, or whether it's really just a political statement. It's easier to vote with your party colleagues on something that's just a statement but will have no effect on public policy. Classic, easiest example of this is what happened with the Affordable Care Act. That this was an issue on which Republicans took dozens of roll call votes all through the Obama years after the passage of the ACA in 2010. By Newsweek count, it was 70 such votes were taken before Republicans won unified control of government in 2016. In fact, in 2015, they easily passed a repeal bill that was then sent to President Obama for a veto. And they used the exact same process that they would attempt to use in 2017 via budget reconciliation. It didn't get a lot of news coverage at the time because everybody understood it was going to be vetoed. So the AARP did not run a multi-million-dollar campaign against it. There were no tearful monologues on Jimmy Kimmel Live in 2015 when they were considering it. Members' phone lines were not jammed with calls. There were not protests in town halls because everybody knew that it wasn't happening. But they took lots of votes, and if you looked at those votes, you'd think Republicans were totally unified on the issue. But then when they won control, in 2016, it became feasible for them to legislate on the issue. Suddenly, the internal fractures hamstrung the party from moving forward. Here's how Joe Barton explained it. He said, sometimes you're playing fantasy football, and sometimes you're in the real game. He said that in response to a reporter's question about why it was so hard to pass repeal and replace when it had been so easy to pass it in 2015. Senator John Thune says, well, it's like in this case, playing with live ammunition. So being able to hold together on a messaging vehicle that has no chance of becoming law does not mean that a party is really unified on the issues at stake. There's a lot of messaging that happens in Capitol Hill. Even though Boehner was present for those many repeal votes that took place after 2010, those efforts to repeal Obamacare. Here's what he said after he left Congress. He said, in the 25 years that I served in the United States Congress, Republicans never, ever, one time agreed on what a health care proposal should look like. Not once. So the bottom line is that congressional parties are much more cohesive in roll call voting. Party leaders have a lot more power in organizing the Congress and in directing policy making, but this does not translate into high levels of party achievement in lawmaking. Majority parties are no more effective at lawmaking than the majority parties of the 1970s and 1980s. Now, part of the problem is measurement error, that we shouldn't rely so much on roll call votes to gauge party unity. Parties are not as unified on policy as they seem based on roll call voting. But the second key point from these data is that the party-polarized Congress still enacts laws on the basis of bipartisan assent. There's a lot of partisan bickering and a lot of gridlock, but congressional action remains more bipartisan than the public realizes. Majority parties today seem to be enmeshed in a constant cycle of overpromising and underdelivering. They are continually messaging their disagreements with one another, and they promise their supporters the moon and the stars if they just get unified government. But the record of their achievements is pretty dismal, even under unified government. In fact, the record in majority parties in unified government isn't even much better than in divided government. The difference between the parties is 50% failure rate in divided government, 43% failure rate in unified government. Surely this contributes to public cynicism in that parties are promising so much and able to deliver so little. Surely these patterns are disillusioning, and they can't do very much for trust in the political system or faith in its ability to produce change. So I'm happy to take your questions.
I was wondering if the major change in party behavior could have something to do with the way society is changing, with so many people who were involved in dying industries such as coal and steel falling farther and farther in purchasing power, and so many people who are involved in more urban industries which are really doing well. I'm just wondering if the big economic divides in our country could be partially responsible for this behavior, and what other things you think might be responsible for this.
No question, there are very severe policy challenges facing American government that neither party has a solution to. The parties are in competition for power, and so what can they say that will make voters want or to prefer them to the opposition? And so a lot of the time what they're left to do is message. They don't have policy answers to a lot of the problems, but they are able to excite voters to care about which side or which party has a majority. And so a lot of the conflict that you see in Congress is over matters of symbolism or political messages targeted at different constituencies. But on the glass half full side, the public say they would like to see Congress working together. Now, there's a lot of problems that Congress is failing to address. But of the problems that Congress does successfully address, that happens via bipartisanship. Just too hard for parties to legislate without bipartisan support. Either it's checks and balances or it's their own internal fractures. So party is less important for policy outcomes than partisan rhetoric would lead you to think.
Do you have any data or information how much direct public contact with their senators influences their voting?
I don't have data on that. I would say that congressional offices do monitor information that they get from their constituencies. Every office has processes for keeping tabs on who calls, how many calls they received, and what the breakdown is on one side or the other. It's hard for senators, House members alike, to vote for legislation that's unpopular. So public opinion also matters there. They recognize the danger. Members in safe districts are less concerned or less fearful than members in swing districts, but every majority party relies on an increment of members from swing districts and can't move forward without their support. So public opinion does matter, even though obviously much of the time parties are talking to their base voters who are not going to swing one way or the other, and whose opinions they know.
It would seem to me that the executive orders are defining a whole lot of what is happening in terms of policy, and that the Congress seems to be falling farther and farther behind on its ability to support what the president's doing, enact what the president's doing. They're grumbling about what the president's doing. Have I got any of that right?
There's no question that recent presidents have been bolder in their use of unilateral authority, delegated authorities. Congress has delegated a great deal of authority to the executive branch, and presidents have been bolder in how broadly they interpret their ability to change policy within existing law. With that said, presidents do need law if they want enduring policy change, if they want change that will outlast their presidency. And so here Congress matters, and yes, you're right, opposition to presidents is like one of the main things Congress does. It doesn't matter what the partisan configuration is, that Congress resists presidents. On the other hand, the body of law is large, it grows every Congress. Every Congress passes a significant amount of legislation. In fact, Congress is not passing less legislation as gauged by the number of pages of legislative text in recent Congresses than it was in the 1990s and 1980s. They just do it in more omnibus form. So Congress is still an important actor. When Congress is gridlocked internally, highly partisan, unable to reach an institutional consensus, then you're right to say they can't respond. When presidents interpret the authorization of force from 2003 as still permitting military action in the Middle East now, and the Congress is internally divided about what to do, it cannot respond. So we see that, and it's a fair criticism of a talk that focuses on Congress to say, well, what about the president? And presidents are being bolder. But when presidents want to make enduring change, they do need the Congress.
Yeah, so those really high party unity votes, are they inflated because of all these symbolic votes, like the voting against Obamacare 60 times? Is that the main reason, or are they counting a lot of naming post office type votes?
Well, the naming post offices are not going to pass on party lines, so they're not going to generate the party conflict. Those will pass overwhelmingly. Very little legislation passes via a party vote, dividing 90% of one party from 90% of the other party. That almost never happens, which showing you the extent to which the minority party supports enacted legislation. So it's not on the enactments. So it's on other stuff. So we know that. Now, I think a lot of it has to do with messaging. But it's very hard for me to code a vote and say, well, that was a messaging vote. Because it's not like members go out on the floor and say, well, this is just for messaging. They're not transparent about that. And so I can't think of a way to gauge ex ante and say this is clearly a messaging vote. But there's some where, you're passing something like stopping they come up with creative names for legislation, stopping Barack Obama's Unsustainable Deficit Act, and you're going to pass that under Barack Obama. Not likely. So that's a clear case of a messaging vote. But in most cases, you're not able to do it, but it's clearly there. And then there's the censorship, where because the party's internally divided, we fought about it in caucus, we're not going to take it to the floor. And so then you don't see those divisions. And so we come away with the impression that these parties are just these unified blocks. That's what they want you to think, because it's a way to excite their voters and to say that the stakes really matter in elections, because look at us, this is all the things we will do if you just give us the power. But their ability to carry through on that is limited.
Hi. Sorry. So it seems to me that a lot of the divide between parties right now is on a moral divide, and it's a difference between moral reasoning on either side. And my question is, before you said that earlier Congresses, they had more bipartisan support for some of their legislation. So do you think the divide was not based in moral reasoning, but it was based in something else?
Well, morality issues have been prevalent in national politics since the 80s. And so that's a lot of the time series that I'm looking at. They take different forms. So in the 1980s, issues like whether to make MLK Day a holiday, or school busing in the 1970s, or school prayer used to be a bigger issue when they would take votes on in Congress. So the moral issues shift. I didn't, in a previous book, Beyond Ideologies, came out in 2009, so I haven't updated the data since then. I did not find that there had been an increase in moral issues as a share of the roll call votes that Congress was taking. So encoding those, didn't see that that was increasing. And in fact, if it did increase, the parties are marginally more internally divided on moral issues than they are on economic issues. Economic issues produce the starkest party differences between Republicans and Democrats. There long been a pro-life faction in the Democratic Party, smaller than it used to be, but there had long been. And in the Republican Party, for a long time, there had been a group of pro-choice Republicans. So they've declined, but moral issues have historically been wedge issues, divide the parties internally more than split the parties one from another. So I think the way in which the moral issues cut the parties has changed, but they haven't increased their presence in our politics as gauged by the congressional agenda. They may have increased their presence as gauged by campaign advertising. So there's different ways of looking at the role that they play in our political debate.
So, from what I can understand, it seems that a large part of what's causing the ineffectiveness of our Congress today is the lack of ability to garner bipartisan support, and as well as like inter-party conflict. But I feel like if you were to address bipartisan support, you would also be able to address inter-party conflict by being able to, convince the other side. So my question to you would be, who do you think the best actor is to encourage bipartisanship in Congress so that we can make our Congress more effective?
That's a very hard question. The way I think about Congress is that they do what they have to do to make the institution function. Congress works best in terms of crisis. If the government's going to shut down, they finally are able to strike a deal. Now, once in a while, they go over the cliff, but that Congress tends to act at the deadline. that focuses the mind. What requires them to be bipartisan is that it's just necessary. You can't, as a majority party, you've got internal fractures among your members, and members who do not want to vote for something that's highly controversial, especially swing state members or swing district members. So they want bipartisanship for cover for themselves. They don't want to support something if it's only them. And so they need bipartisanship to go along. At the same time, you often need bipartisanship just to clear the veto players, the filibuster in the Senate, or the fact there's divided government 75% of the time since 1980. So you need bipartisanship for that reason. And so they are confronted with this. This is just the reality that they face. I don't think they do it out of the goodness of their heart. I think they do it because this is what the system requires of them. And it's especially important at a time with narrowly divided public. With both parties are really minority parties. Neither party has a natural majority in the electorate. And so you'd expect it to be hard to govern under these circumstances. The public is not cohesive either. And Congress reflects that. I think we have a tendency to blame Congress for things it's not responsible for. I mean, the fact that they fight, that they're divided, reflects divisions in society. It doesn't originate with them. And they struggle through it. And they get more done than they get credit for, in great part because of the way the news media covers politics, which is they cover politics more than policy, and they cover conflict more than resolution. So we don't get very much attention to what actually does happen in policy terms. A lot of major legislation passed at the end of December 2019. That was the holidays, so people aren't focused on that. But it got covered as, well, they kept the government from shutting down. But there was a lot in that omnibus legislation, including, one thing that got some attention was that they raised the age at which tobacco products could be purchased to 21. There was also significant revision of the tax treatment of pensions and your ability to inherit IRAs. That was changed at the end of the year. And very little attention, but this was significant legislation, affects a lot of people. No coverage. Coverage only on conflict because it's exciting. And people watch news and tune into news for entertainment rather than for being informed about what what's actually happening in public policy terms. So I guess that's a way of saying Congress does more than people recognize, in great part because of the way the news filter works. But to the extent that it functions, it's because they have to strike deals, because no party has sufficient power or cohesion to do it by itself.
Hi, Professor Lee. I will be very excited to read your forthcoming book, and I think you've presented quite a convincing story that the image of party cohesion is pretty much a result of the selection bias that the leaders of the parties strategically and intentionally create. I think the following question that one may ask, I think, is that why they choose to do so, why the party leaders want such an image. You did mention in the presentation that the motivation might be to attract more voters. But my question is that do we have evidence for that, especially in the swing states where the voters might not appreciate a cohesive party line that much? Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. So you have to think about the leader's perspective versus the member's perspective. Members often do not find it in their own electoral interest to vote lockstep with the party. That to preserve some flexibility, some distance is useful for them. And individual members of Congress like to brag about how bipartisan they are. If you listen to them or look at the way they message to their constituencies. But when the parties are locked in a battle for control, party control, majority control of Congress, they have to make a case. Why should voters prefer us to the opposing party? And so leaders want to shepherd the party to answer that question. They want to drive a media narrative about what they would offer that the other party will not support, how they would do things differently than the other party, why then people should care that they should hold on to their majority, or if they're in the minority, why they should take it, why they should be given the majority, why we should throw the majority out of power and put them in power instead. And so here you need to show lockstep action, because that's your warrant. That's to say we will do what we say we are going to do. And so that's the incentive from the vantage point of a party leader under competitive circumstances. And so these are ways in which the interests of individual members are not always perfectly aligned with what's in the interests of the party. And but what agenda control is something the leaders possess.
We have one more question in the front here, but Professor Lee will stick around, so if you have additional questions, you can certainly feel free to come up after the talk, but we'll have one last question here.
Once the House sends a bill to the Senate, who are the major players who determine which pathways it goes through, and what are those pathways?
Well, a bill that comes over from the House would go to the Committee of Jurisdiction in the Senate, and so whatever that committee would be. And then the committee chair has plenary power to decide whether to move forward on anything the House sends over. And most of what the House sends over is dead on arrival in the Senate and will never see any further consideration. Now, the top leaders of the Senate can circumvent this. So that was what I showed you the data on bills that go around the committee process. So there are ways in which the leadership can step in and rescue a measure that they want to see get through. But most of the time, the committee chair really decides. And if the committee chair doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen.
Well, okay, so a bill comes over on education.
Yes, the help committee. Yes, in that case.
And the jurisdiction committee can say, well, we're not going to send it on to the education committee. And the education committee chairman and his allies are dying for that bill to come over.
It will go. It goes. So the committee's jurisdictions are set in the rules of Congress. So it's not a matter of discretion whether you send it to the committee or not. It will go automatically to the committee unless the leadership can step in and go around. Usually not. The way it works in that case is it's not the same bill. They take a different bill number and will insert language so they can rescue it that way. But it will automatically go to the committee with jurisdiction and the standing rules of the chamber, whether that be the House or the Senate. Introduced bills in the House, there's limited discretion there for the presiding officer. In the Senate, there's virtually no discretion about which committee will receive a bill. If it's in its jurisdiction, it goes to that committee.